This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Chuck Rice University Distinguished Professor in Agronomy and Romulo Lollato, K-State Wheat Production Specialist, begin today's show with two segments discussing a recent report, Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative. They explain how their research impacts agriculture in the country and Kansas. Chuck and Romulo also share how this was a collaborative effort. Ending today's show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he encourages producers to track the trends in the industry and determine whether they're a good fit for their operation. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about a report titled Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative with University Distinguished Professor in Agronomy Chuck Rice and K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Chuck, Romulo, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Chuck, before we dive into the information in this report, can you explain to us what you mean by greenhouse gas negative?
Yeah, so actually the report started out to say carbon negative because there's a lot of interest in carbon, right? And we know CO2 in the atmosphere is having effects on changing climates. And so carbon was the focus, or was the word used. But then in the report, it really talks about two other greenhouse gases. So CO2 is one of the major greenhouse gases. And then the other two are nitrous oxide, nitrogen, and it's 300 times more potent than a molecule of CO2 as far as greenhouse gas. So what happens is as sunlight energy bounces off the surface as heat energy, it goes back to the atmosphere and outer space. But we have these greenhouse gases that absorb some of that heat and warm our planet, which is a good thing. The question is, can we have too much of a good thing? And that's what we're seeing now. So besides carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, as I mentioned, and then methane is the three major ones. There's some other ones, but those are the three major ones. Methane in agriculture is emitted from saturated soils, so rice systems, which we don't have in Kansas for the most part. But then the major one is from livestock.
This is a national level report, and what information did you hope to get from it?
This report started out on a farm in Chip Bowling. It was the initial meeting of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action Group. It was Alliance at that time, and they changed their name to In Action. But the challenge was, we're talking about farming and ranching, and one of the questions was, how is climate change affecting production? And then also agriculture represents about 10% of the greenhouse gases emitted in the United States. So how can we reduce that footprint for U.S. agriculture? And so that's what started this report.
And what is some of the information you found?
Yeah, so this was a comprehensive study. It took a long time. It took about 5 years to produce, much longer than I wanted. But it was led by, there was three of us that kind of coordinated everything. Marty Matlock, professor at University of Arkansas, and then Jerry Hatfield, who is a retired ARS scientist. And so we led the effort recruiting the authors, designing the chapters. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then getting the authors to write the different chapters, and that's where Romulo came in. So the report covers all major sectors of U.S. agriculture. We look at carbon, we look at nitrogen, we look at methane, so it's really animal agriculture, food waste. Was a little bit different because most of the chapters are focused on farm production. Food waste is off the farm. but it represents about 30% of our food that we produce is wasted. So that needs to be part of the discussion. And then energy was the other one. And so we can talk a little bit more about the details. And then the other component was closing the yield gap. And if we're going to produce more food on the same amount or more or less land, then we need to improve the yield potential of our cropping systems.
And Romulo, talking some about your chapter, what did you find when it comes to greenhouse gases and yield gap?
So I was very excited when Chuck first invited me to participate in this chapter, right? Because this is an area that I'm very interested in particular at that time, the yield gap. It really opened up another whole area of research for my group in terms of looking a little bit more into the global warming potential of these practices that we take as well. But essentially, as Chuck was mentioning, there is a need for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And to be perhaps negative. But at the same time, food production is, there's a report that just came out saying that we need to produce 2.8% per year more food, right, to meet our food demand. And our yield gain of the major crops is shorter than 1%. So there's a big gap there in terms of where we need to be in terms of consumption increases versus where we are in terms of food production increases. And that's kind of where our chapter focused there. So what do we mean with yield gaps? Essentially, where are farmers today versus where they could be in terms of their potential, right? So if their potential, for example, is 80 bushels per acre in a given crop in a given region, but they are at 40, there's a huge gap there and that needs to be fulfilled, right? And many times, by increasing our yields, we can do that without necessarily increasing greenhouse gas emissions in a huge amount, right? It's a matter of being more efficient than anything else. And with that, I can give an example that brings a little bit closer to home here in our wheat production systems, right? We've done a survey of practices among growers, and we found that, the global warming potential of those wheat fields, it had a huge range. It went from about 1,100 pounds of CO2 equivalent per acre all the way to about 2,200. So it's almost a 2.2-fold range in how much each one of those fields are actually emitting in terms of, their global warming potential. Now, when we looked at the relationship of global warming in each field with the yield in each field, if there was any relationship there, we could say, okay, at least we're emitting more, but we are producing more as well. But that was not the case. There was no relationship at all. So meaning that we had a scatter of points there of fields that were producing a lot and emitting very little. Then fields that were producing a lot and emitting a lot as well, right? And on the other way, and fields that were emitting very little, but also producing very little. And so we kind of need to find that benchmark of where we want to be, which is low emissions, but high yield, right? That way we can actually feed a growing population and try to meet that demand without necessarily hampering the environmental part, right? And so that's what was very highlighting to me is like a huge yield gap in many crops around the world that we can kind of identify as we're doing this chapter with Chuck. And many times that yield gap can be narrowed without necessarily increasing our environmental footprint. It's a matter of being of optimizing our resources. And then part of our chapter gets into optimizing those resources via nutrient management, right? The 4 R's of nutrient management: right place, right source, right amount, and right timing, right? For example, we also get a little bit on the physiology side in terms of can we improve our plants to maybe be more efficient as well. So it was a very fun chapter to write. And I think that it also brought to our Kansas growers, our Kansas farmers, there's some very applied outputs coming out of that in terms of how do we grow more yield but maintain our environmental footprint on the low end.
Chuck, what do you see as some opportunities for agriculture becoming greenhouse gas negative?
Yeah, so yield was important. The other chapters, one was carbon, right? And so in that carbon chapter, we looked at ways to sequester carbon in soils. And it turns out about 40% of the potential to be neutral or negative was through soil carbon sequestration. So how do we do that? Well, it's things like less tillage, no-till being the prime example. But then it's packaging, looking at that as a system, and that's a key point of this report, is looking at a system. But then how do you introduce cover crops where possible? Maybe apply organic amendments, manure or compost. And then the nice thing about that is when you improve carbon, sequester carbon, then you improve soil health, which then that makes that soil more productive and more resilient to weather extremes. So it's a win-win situation. So that's the carbon, right? And certainly in Kansas, actually Kansas is probably one of the leaders in adoption of no-till. It's about 40%, but then the adoption of cover crops is less than, I think, 5%. So there's a huge opportunity. Again, water constraints, but again, I think there's an opportunity to increase adoption of cover crops and then some of these other practices. So that's the carbon chapter.
And my comment there, just follow up here and to our Kansas growers too. I have been working with a number of farmers out in the western part of the state who routinely add manure to their fields, and it's exactly what Chuck was mentioning. Those organic matter levels rising over years, and the fertility of that soil as well, and those yields simply being more stable, right? A little bit more less variable in function of the environment. So it really applies directly to what our growers are.
Yeah, and especially as we see more weather extremes across the state.
That was Kansas State University's Chuck Rice and Romulo Lollato. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Chuck and Romulo as we continue our conversation. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation on the potential for U.S. agriculture to be greenhouse gas negative with University Distinguished Professor in Agronomy Chuck Rice and K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Chuck, as we continue this conversation, what is another chapter of this report?
So the nitrogen, major input cost for the farmer. And so what that chapter looked at was basically looking at ways to improve nitrogen management. Romulo mentioned the 4 R's, right place, right time, right form, and right rate. But then we went a little bit farther. The chapter authors went a little bit farther in looking at precision agriculture and how can we variably apply nitrogen. And what the chapter also identified, there are parts of the field, and it turns out several studies have shown somewhere around 10 or 15% of a field is not productive. You're losing money just planting seed in the ground. But we think, we got to plant this whole field. And what they were suggesting was if we can identify those areas with data and precision and remote sensing, then we can maybe take those areas and putting into some other land use. So a perennial crop for, say, biofuels or forage for animals or pollinator habitats. And what you're doing is you're also, those deep roots are sequestering carbon, but then you're not putting nitrogen on those areas and releasing nitrogen to the atmosphere. So it really ties in. We're helping the environment, but really increasing profitability for those farms. And so we need to, again, think it as a systems approach.
What's another one of those chapters, Chuck?
So one that's important for Kansas was animal agriculture. Methane is a major source. About 50% globally of the methane is coming from from agriculture, and animal agriculture would be the major one besides, like I said, rice paddies. But again, there's a lot of technologies that's available. We're not talking, part of this report was not looking at 30 or 50 years away. What research or what technologies are available in the next 5, 10 years that we could implement? So we're not looking at very futuristic. So there's a lot of opportunities. But animal agriculture is a little bit harder, but there are things like feed quality. There's work being done to look at reducing by improving feed quality, reduce the methane that's produced in the stomach of the livestock, the cattle, and cattle and dairy operations are the ones that come from the ruminants as far as methane release. So looking at management of the feed, down the road maybe breeding for livestock that have lower emissions, and we're working on that now. And then another part was manure management. How do you handle the manure? Again, post management of that manure, if it's a lagoon system, then there's a lot of methane released. So how do you manage that? And there's work already available, technologies already available to capture that methane and either use it as a fuel or convert it to CO2. Methane is about 30 times more potent than a molecule of CO2. So converting from methane to CO2 reduces that impact, but it'd be better if we could use it as a biofuel. So there's some technologies, again, for animal agriculture. And then the fourth area that we looked at for production side was energy. And I think Kansas is probably one of the leaders in this area. The farm in Kansas should be energy self-sufficient and actually export energy, and we're doing that now. With wind turbines on the farm, we can produce crops or graze livestock underneath those turbines and producing energy for that farm and then exporting it. Solar is another area. There's a lot of structures on a farm, and if we put solar panels on top of those roofs, we can essentially eliminate the need for importing electricity into the farm and probably actually export it with agrivoltaics and that. So I think there's a huge potential. And again, that reduces the electrical demand. It depends on how you produce that electricity, but the farm has a great potential to be, with renewables, an energy exporter. So again, that's a way to reduce the greenhouse gases and make it negative.
What is that final piece of information from this report?
So what we did in the final chapter was to assemble all these different components and then find out what the potential for agriculture, U.S. agriculture, to be as far as reducing emissions. And so what we showed was if you have a moderate adoption rate, and moderate was defined as 50%, right? So we're not talking really high adoption rates, but 50% adoption of these practices, that U.S. agriculture could be about neutral. And then with 75% adoption, then you would be about 6%, 4 to 6% negative. So we're not talking 90, 100% adoption. It is a high adoption rate, 75%. One important piece of the message that we've been talking about is this is not, single option strategies. We're looking at it as a system. A farmer today or a rancher today, they're looking at it as a system and not, looking at nitrogen or what crop I'm growing. They're looking at it as a package. And so the important thing here is that there's multiple strategies that can be plugged into a system, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all or do this one thing. It really provides multiple options. That makes it harder because you can't say, do this, and you're going to get this result. But it depends on the climate and the soils and the risk for the farmer.
As we wrap up today's conversation, from each of your perspectives, what do you want Kansas farmers and ranchers to take from this? Romulo, starting with you.
Well, I guess for me, the most highlighting things here is that we can increase our yields and be more efficient in terms of environmental outcomes, right? And that's a huge issue here, especially as we see many programs that are developing by the industry now in terms of traceability of the grain and so on. It's not all about simply reducing inputs. It's about being more efficient with the inputs that we use. And so we can increase our yields and still be more, let's say, environmentally friendly, and increasing yields is a very important thing. Now, I say that because at the farm level, higher yields is what actually drives economics, right? And so we can meet both at the same time. That was my main highlight from this entire project, and was was very, very interesting for me to learn about all else going on as well. So I appreciate the chance that Chuck, the invite that I had to be part of.
Yeah, and Romulo said it well, that we're talking about efficiency. So that means more profitability. So a lot of these practices or strategies will result in increased efficiency and increased profitability, right? So if I do less tillage, I'm using less fuel. If I'm using less nitrogen, that's a high input cost, then I've reduced my input cost and increased my profitability. So it's not, okay, we got to sacrifice profitability for the environment. We get both, right? And so that's a really important piece there. So the economics is really important.
If people are wanting to find out more information about this report, how can they do that?
Yeah, so good question. So the report and interpretive summary is on the USFRA website. I don't have that in front of me, but you can go to that report. Also, CAST, the Council for Agriculture and Science Technology, produced the report, and it's on their website as well. And then, of course, our local K-State Research and Extension has information on nitrogen management and tillage systems and that.
Chuck, Romulo, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was University Distinguished Professor in Agronomy Chuck Rice and K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato, and they were talking about their new report, Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative. If you'd like to find this report, there are a few different ways you can do that. The first one is by going to the website for U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. That website is usfarmersandranchers.org. Again, that is usfarmersandranchers.org. You can also go to the Council for Agriculture Science and Technology's website, which is cast-science.org. That is cast-SCIENCE.org. I will link these websites in today's show notes on acttoday.net. There will also be a link to the K-State Research and Extension's bookstore, where you can find other publications around this topic. The website for the K-State Research and Extension bookstore is bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines. We're now cutting to that short break.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. As dairy producers look to increase their bottom line, K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk encourages them to keep tracking the trends in the industry to determine whether they should be implementing some of those strategies on their farms.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some trends we're seeing in our U.S. dairy industry and how they might impact the decision on our individual dairy farms. You know, as we look across the dairy industry across the United States, we continue to see the number of farms decreasing and actually decreasing at a fairly rapid rate the last few years, and that will likely continue, as well as we've seen an increase in the number of dairy cows per herd. And as we crossed over the 350 cows per herd average for 2023, we'll see that likely grow again in 2024. As we see some other large producers begin production on some units across the United States, as well as loss of some of our smaller farms across the United States as well. Also, we've been seeing a fairly rapid increase in the amount of milk that we get from each of our dairy cows, and that will continue to increase and grow as that adds to our total milk production. So that's how it looks on a national basis. How does it look here in the central order? And as we look at that, many of our states have seen decreases in the number of dairy herds, and Kansas is no stranger to that. We continue to lose dairy herds every year. However, when we look at the total number of cows in the state, that continues to grow. So how does that compare to some of our neighbors? Well, our decrease in dairy herds has been a little bit less than maybe what some of our neighbors have experienced. So as you look to Missouri or you look upward to Iowa in terms of number of losses of dairy herds in their states, they've had a much sharper drop than we have. As we look at average number of cows per herd, some interesting things there. Here in Kansas, obviously, we're growing in the number of cows per herd. So our trend here in Kansas is a decrease in the number of herds, but increase in the number of dairy cows per herd. As we look at milk production per cow, that's an area where Kansas also has seen some increases over the last 10 to 15 years. As you look next door to our friends in Missouri, they've been fairly stable in production per cow. So when you think about that, the number of cows per farm not changing very much in Missouri and the production per cow not changing much, you can see that the milk flow off the farm would not have changed greatly as compared to a state like Kansas, where we have a growing number of cows per herd as well as a growing amount of milk harvested per cow each year. So how does this all relate to your dairy farm here in Kansas? Well, I think it's important that you keep track of the trends in the industry. As we see that more farms are shipping more milk off their farm, whether that be through an increase in the number of cows and or an increase in milk production per cow, it is an increase in the revenue that they're taking in. So if we're not going to expand our herd, or if we're not going to seek ways to increase milk production per cow, the other thing we would have to focus on is trying to cut expenses. Well, there's generally a limit to that, and many times we're not very successful in the financial arena when we just simply focus on cutting expenses. So you might look at other things that you might be able to export from your farm other than milk if you're not going to be changing the number of cows or trying to increase milk production on your farm. You might look at things like ag tourism or other ways you can market your milk other than just into the raw fluid milk stream, as that will limit your income. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a look at their own herds and the trends that they're seeing there compared to the industry, and see if there are some things that you can learn from those trends and how you need to operate your own farm.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.